I Am Helen Keller by Grace Norwich, Part 2. Chapter 7, page 61. Off to the Big City. In the fall of 1894, when Helen was 14 years old, she and Annie set off for New York City. What was a deaf-blind girl from the South doing in a big, crazy, and back then very smelly, city like Manhattan? Pursuing Helen's never-ending quest to learn. Helen was in New York to attend the Wright-Humason School for the Deaf, where she would take a full course load, including math, English, American history, French, and German. That was in addition to working on her lip reading and speaking skills. That was a lot of work, even for someone as smart as Helen. But she was determined to get through the high school courses that would prepare her for college. Helen insisted that she was going to college. That was a pretty outrageous claim, even for someone as exceptional as Helen. Most women didn't go to college in those days, let alone deaf-blind ones. As if that goal wasn't challenging enough, she set her sights on the women's college with the best reputation in the country, Radcliffe, Harvard's sister school. Though it seemed like a dream to most people, Helen believed she could do anything a hearing and seeing girl could. There was one problem, however, money, and Helen and Annie didn't have any. Although the Kellers had once been a prominent family, for the last several years before his death in 1896, Captain had huge debts. He hadn't paid Annie to teach Helen for years. If Helen and Annie worried about how they were going to pay for Wright-Humason or college, they didn't show it well in New York, where they lived like rich ladies. That's because very wealthy people like John D. Rockefeller became Helen's benefactors, which means they gave her money so she could continue to study. They paid for a school, a nice house, and daily horseback rides in Central Park for both Helen and Annie. Helen had the time of her life in New York. She went to the dog show at Madison Square Garden because she and Annie loved fancy breeds of dogs. Helen even went to the top of the Statue of Liberty. Chapter 8, page 67. Next stop, college. New York was a great experience, but if Helen was really going to get into Radcliffe, she needed to go to a school that was even harder than Wright-Humason. She needed to go to a school for hearing girls. Again, Helen set her sights on one of the top prep schools in the country, the Cambridge School for Young Ladies in Massachusetts. At first, the headmaster, Arthur Gilman, had been worried about admitting Helen. He wasn't sure she'd be able to keep up with the difficult curriculum. But Helen proved any fears totally unfounded when she aced her first year at the demanding school. In fact, she did so well, the school said she could graduate early. It was hard work, especially for Annie, who had to sign teachers' lectures into Helen's hand as they spoke, as well as translate entire books they couldn't get in Braille by manual alphabet. This proved especially difficult for Annie, since she didn't know French, German, or Latin, so she had to learn the subjects while signing them for Helen. Unfortunately, Helen's second year was an academic bust, mainly because of math, which, even with her determination and smarts, she just couldn't seem to grasp. The stress and strain on Annie and Helen was clear to everyone, including Headmaster Gilman. Teachers were complaining to him that Annie was too hard on Helen. He wrote to Helen's mom that he thought Annie was harming her daughter and the two should be separated. So far away from the school, Kate worried about her daughter. Trusting the headmaster, she named him Helen's legal guardian to do what he thought best. When Annie was told to leave the school, Helen became hysterical. First, she sobbed uncontrollably. Then she went on a hunger strike. The situation got so bad that Kate finally had to travel from Alabama. After seeing the situation for herself, she completely changed her mind and accused Headmaster Gilman of being the one to harm her daughter. Teacher and Helen would never be separated again. Chapter 9, page 73. Ivy League Girl. After finishing her high school studies with a private tutor, Helen passed her college entrance exams and in 1900 became the first deaf-blind person in the country to attend college. And not just any old college, Helen achieved her goal of making it into Radcliffe. Wanting something is one thing, and getting it is another. Once at Radcliffe, the classes were so hard, they made the Cambridge schools seem like kindergarten. They worked as they had before, with Annie translating the professor's lectures in class. With only a high school education herself, Annie now had to interpret lessons from instructors at the top college in the country. She struggled to understand the meaning of their words just as fast as she put them into Helen's hands. Between the classes and spelling out the big academic books, Annie was totally exhausted. Meanwhile, even with Annie's help, Helen faced challenges. She couldn't take notes during lectures because her hands were busy listening to Annie's translation. So when she got back to her room, Helen had to type everything she could remember on her Braille computer. She couldn't even complain to her fellow classmates. None of them knew the manual alphabet, which meant their interactions didn't go much further than hello and how are you. A sense of isolation enfolds me like a cold mist as I sit alone, she wrote about that time. Although she was already cramming day and night to keep up, Helen decided to take on an added assignment. During her sophomore year of college, she was asked by Ladies' Home Journal to write a series of articles about her life. Although handling a professional writing gig on top of her schoolwork seemed impossible, Helen couldn't say no, in part because they offered her $3,000 for the articles. That was a fortune back then. It probably won't come as a surprise that the editors sent back her first article because it wasn't any good. There was a long list of complaints. It rambled on without any point, jumping around in time, making no sense, and sometimes leaving out important information. Just as she received the harsh criticism, the editors were already sending urgent telegrams saying they needed the next article, right away. As Helen put it herself, she was in deep water. Friends of Helen and Annie recommended they hire John Albert Macy, a young Harvard English professor and editor of Youth's Companion, a popular children's magazine, to shape her ideas into professional pieces. Not only did John fix her articles so that Ladies' Home Journal was proud to run them, but he also came up with the idea to string all the articles together into a memoir. The end result was The Story of My Life, published to great reviews in 1903, when Helen was just a 22-year-old college junior. Helen's books. The Story of My Life was just the first of a long list of books written by Helen. Here are some of her other titles: Out of the Dark, The World I Live In, My Religion, Midstream, My Later Life, Teacher, Anne Sullivan Macy. Helen graduated from college on June 28, 1904, as the first deaf-blind person in the country to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree. Chapter 10, page 81. An Unlikely Love Story. John not only helped Helen become a published author, he also fell in love with Annie. He asked her to marry him many times, but she refused him over and over. She might have worried about the fact that he was more than 10 years younger than her. For sure, she was nervous about what a marriage might mean for Helen's future. The two were closer than sisters. In the end, Annie made John ask Helen's permission. When he did, he assured Helen that she would live with them, and nothing between her and Annie would change. Even if it had to change, Helen gave her wholehearted blessing. She wanted her beloved teacher to be happy. John was true to his word. After he and Annie were married in 1905, the three of them settled down in the Wrentham, Massachusetts farmhouse that Annie and Helen had bought together earlier. This could have easily been an awkward arrangement, but it turned out to be a bit of heaven, Helen wrote. The warm home was always filled with good food, fresh flowers, and dear friends. John helped Helen with the writing she did in her cozy new study. He put ropes along the fields so that Helen could take walks by herself around the property, and he also introduced her to politics. John, a member of the Socialist Party of America, which was popular in the early 20th century, introduced Helen to the writings of communism's founder, Karl Marx, and other radical thinkers of the time. Although Annie didn't approve, Helen took up John's views and joined the Socialist Party. She also joined the suffrage movement that fought to give women the right to vote. In 1913, Helen took her new political views public with her book, Out of the Dark. The sweet, deaf-blind girl who made the best out of any situation had been replaced by a fighter whose strong opinions on behalf of others shocked a lot of people, including her own conservative Southern family. Not only did she stand up for the rights of workers, women who wanted to vote, and other deaf-blind people, she also joined the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, to fight against racial segregation. Helen stuck up for anyone who didn't get a fair shot because they were considered different. Page 85. The S word. A lot of people talk about socialism now like it's evil, but its basic principle is fairness. The idea is that there shouldn't be rich or poor people. Instead, everyone should share wealth. In socialist countries, the government controls factories and the amount of possessions people get. Helen's views didn't go that far, but she did believe in fairer rights for workers, who during her time often labored 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, without any kind of compensation if they got hurt while on the job. Chapter 11, page 87. Helen speaks up. As Helen stood on the stage in front of a crowd gathered to hear her speak in an auditorium in Montclair, New Jersey, her heart seemed to stop beating, and her voice choked in her throat. On a cold February day in 1913, she was supposed to give the very first lecture that was part of a big speaking tour. For all the grueling work she'd done to use her voice, she didn't think she could squeak out the first word of her speech. The heart and the hand were the right use of our senses. All these people, whose movements she could feel as they shifted in their seats, had paid good money to hear her speak, money that she and Annie desperately needed to live. She had no other choice than to get on with it, so Helen finally began to talk. Although she was still hard to understand, Annie stayed on stage to interpret. The audience loved hearing all about her hopes, fears, and joys. The lecture tour was a huge success all across the country. Alas, not everything was going as well as Helen's lectures. Annie and John were having serious troubles in their marriage. They fought all the time. He thought Annie was too involved with Helen. Meanwhile, she accused him of spending too much money and drinking. In May 1913, John sailed for Europe on a voyage of more than 4 months without his wife. Absence did not make the heart grow fonder. And when he returned, he and Annie fought worse than ever. By 1914, he had moved out of the farmhouse and split from Annie, although they were never formally divorced. Back to page 89, the gray box. Famous folks who came to hear Helen speak. Electric light bulb inventor Thomas Edison. Former President William Howard Taft. Legendary opera tenor Enrico Caruso. Ford Motor Company founder Henry Ford. Back on page 90. That wasn't Annie's only issue. She started to experience health problems as well. Worried that she wasn't well enough to be Helen's sole guardian and keep up with the organization of their increasingly busy lives, Annie hired Polly Thompson, a Scottish woman who became Helen's lifelong trusted companion. Annie turned out to be the one who needed Polly's help. Her health continued to go downhill until the summer of 1916, when Annie's doctor said her only chance for surviving was to go to a special clinic in Lake Placid, New York. Polly went along to help aid in Annie's recovery. It was never easy for Helen to be separated from her dear Annie. The two were as close as could be. But this time she had someone else to keep her from feeling lonely. Earlier that year, when Polly had to return to Scotland, Annie had hired another secretary to fill in. His name was Peter Fagin, and he fell in love with Helen. At 36 years old, Helen had never been in love, but she fell head over heels for Peter. His love was a bright sun that shone upon my helplessness and isolation, she wrote. The sweetness of being loved enchanted me. Although Peter and Helen wanted to get married, they didn't tell anyone about it. Helen's family wouldn't have approved, because in those days, people didn't think those with disabilities should get married. While Helen was staying with her mother during Annie's trip to Lake Placid, she planned to tell Kate about Peter. Unfortunately, a newspaper got a hold of the news that Peter had applied for a marriage license before she had a chance. Kate practically exploded after seeing the headline that her daughter was about to get married. Helen issued a public statement denying that she was going to marry Peter, and Kate forbid him to come anywhere near her daughter. That didn't keep the lovebirds from planning to elope in an elaborate scheme. While Helen traveled with her mother to her sister Mildred's house in Montgomery, Alabama, Peter planned to intercept them when they switched from boat to train in Savannah, Georgia. Then he'd take Helen to Florida to get married. It might have worked, except Peter made the big mistake of reserving passage on the same boat to Georgia as Kate and Helen. When Kate saw the passenger list and his name on it, she quickly made other plans for getting to Montgomery. She and Helen took the train the entire way. Peter still refused to give up. He showed up at Helen's sister home in Montgomery and was holding Helen's hand on the porch when Mildred's husband came running out with a gun and finally scared Peter away for good. Chapter 12, page 97. Helen's name in lights. In 1918, a historian named Francis Trevelyan Miller approached Annie and Helen with an unusual pitch. He wanted to make a movie based on Helen's life. The ladies loved the idea. The movie Deliverance was definitely the Hollywood version of Helen's life. Frances spiced up her story so that it would entertain audiences. That included a love scene supposedly happening in Helen's mind, with her and the ancient hero of the Trojan War, Ulysses. If that wasn't over the top enough, the last scene had Helen leading a procession on a white horse while blowing a trumpet. Helen played herself at the end of the movie, while a little girl played her as a child, and another actress played her at Radcliffe. Although Deliverance got some positive reviews in newspapers, audiences apparently found the movie just as silly as Helen and Annie did. It tanked when it opened in August 1919. Despite the money for the movie, Helen and Annie continued to be troubled by financial problems. They had expensive taste in clothes, dogs, travel, and living arrangements. The lecture circuit was good money, but tough on Helen. So Helen and Annie did something very surprising for a deaf-blind woman and her teacher. They hit the road in 1920 as vaudeville performers. Skipping down to the gray box. What is vaudeville? Vaudeville, a popular form of entertainment until the 1930s, was a bunch of different acts that made up one show. People turned out to theaters to watch comedians, singers, magicians, acrobats, and anyone else who could keep an audience entertained. Going back up to the second paragraph on page 99. Annie and Helen's act wasn't anything crazy. First, Annie told the story of Helen as a little girl and how she taught her to communicate. Then Helen showed how she spelled with her fingers, read lips, and talked. After that, there was a brief question and answer session with the audience. They only had to perform 20 minutes in the afternoon and another 20 in the evening, and for that they were paid $2,000. Not only was it easy money, but Annie and Helen also got to wear the kind of beautiful, intricate, floor-length dresses they loved. Plus, Helen basked in the excited, adoring reaction of the audiences, day after day and night after night. Annie, on the other hand, was not a fan of the theater. She found vaudeville and its cast of characters tacky, and considered Helen too good for this role. To make matters worse, the bright lights hurt her weakening eyes. Polly often had to stand in for Annie as her health and attitude worsened. Still, Helen stuck with her routine until 1924. Nothing kept the show from going on, not even when Helen found out her mother had died in 1921. She was just about to go on stage when she got the devastating news. Like a true professional, she went on with her act, and no one in the audience could have imagined she had just lost one of the most important people in her life. Chapter 13, page 103. Farewell, Teacher. Annie returned from Lake Placid, having recovered from her nasty cough, but she never truly got better. Her health got worse and worse until the last several years of her life, when she was miserable with physical pain. Not only had she become blind again, but she was also covered in infective boils called carbuncles. Despite her terrible condition, Annie never wavered from her devotion to Helen. She continued to accompany her student as they traveled on fundraising trips for the American Foundation for the Blind. In 1935, Helen had taken Annie on a trip to Jamaica that she hoped would raise her spirits. When they returned, however, Annie collapsed and was rushed to the hospital, where the doctor said she'd had a heart attack. Helen never left her teacher's side as Annie drifted into a coma from which she'd never awake. On October 20th, Annie died at the age of 70, right next to Helen, where she'd been for nearly 50 years. Helen wasn't the only one who appreciated how Annie had devoted her life to teaching. 1,200 people attended her funeral in New York. To honor her accomplishments, Annie was the first woman laid to rest in the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., because of her own merits. The bishop in his sermon called Annie among the great teachers of all time. Going to the gray box at the bottom of the page. Teacher. In 1955, Helen paid the ultimate tribute to Annie by publishing a book about her called Teacher. Although writing was always hard for Helen, this book might have been the worst. She got insomnia and eczema while working on it. To make matters worse, her first manuscript went up in flames when the house she and Polly lived in had a furnace fire. Going back to the second paragraph on page 105. No matter the turnout or public recognition, Helen was completely devastated over the loss of her beloved teacher, the woman who had literally introduced her to the world. She needed to find a reason to go on. Helen found it in something that had always driven her, helping others. Helen had traveled the world for some time raising money for the blind. In the last years of Annie's life, she, Annie, and Polly had been to Yugoslavia, Scotland, England, and Ireland. Everywhere she went, the highest dignitaries and the poorest citizens were inspired by her presence and showered her with love and affection. No matter what country, Helen was the ultimate symbol of triumph over adversity. With Polly by her side, Helen threw herself into her missions as an ambassador of hope with renewed energy and took her biggest trip yet. They traveled to Japan, where after a long journey by ship, they were met by thousands of children waving Japanese and American flags. At a banquet in her honor, Helen met the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, the Mayor of Tokyo, and the country's prince, a bigger reception than any other foreigner had ever received before. She repaid them by going all over the country to deliver 97 lectures in 39 cities, spreading her message that the blind, deaf, and those with other handicaps deserve the same respect as anyone else. U.S. Tour. The outbreak of World War II put an end to Helen and Polly's travels abroad for a while, but they didn't stay at home. Instead, they went all over the United States, visiting and lifting the spirits of soldiers hurt or blinded in combat. World Tour. After the end of World War II in 1945 and through the 1950s, Helen and Polly zigzagged all over the world, even though they were already elderly ladies. Their passports were filled with stamps from Japan, South Africa, Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, Israel, and Jordan. Chapter 14, page 111. Fighting to the end. While she was alive, Annie had always worried that something would happen to her and Helen would be left alone. That's one of the reasons she hired Polly. But eventually, Polly became old as well. On September 26, 1957, Polly suffered a stroke while she was in the kitchen of her Connecticut home with Helen, who couldn't call for help. Although it took 2.5 hours for the mailman to arrive and call an ambulance, Polly lived. But she never fully recovered, and on March 21, 1960, at the age of 76, she passed away after spending 46 years with Helen. Helen, who by now was nearly 80 years old, had lost her 2 dearest companions. Still, she found pleasure in life, and the public's fascination with her story never stopped. In fact, it only grew after William Gibson wrote a play about Helen's early life. The Miracle Worker made its Broadway debut in 1959, starring Anne Bancroft as Annie and child star Patty Duke as Helen. The play had intense scenes that showed how hard it was for Annie to get through to Helen, and how much the deaf-blind girl had to overcome. Both Anne and Patty slapped each other in the face during the show. Audiences were moved by the play, which became a smash hit. It ran for 700 performances on Broadway and was turned into a movie in 1962. Until she took her last breath on June 1st, 1968, at the age of 87, Helen never stopped learning, fighting for people's rights, and exceeding the expectations of others. It didn't matter that at the end she could no longer travel around the world, or even leave her home. For Helen, inspiration, hope, strength, and love always lived right inside her. The best and most beautiful things in the world cannot be seen nor even touched, but just felt in the heart. 10 things you should know about Helen Keller. Number 1. An illness Helen contracted before she was 2 years old caused her to go blind and deaf. Number 2. Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, who met Helen when she was a little girl, stayed friends with her throughout his life. Number 3. After Helen finally understood the connection between words and the world, when Annie ran her hand underwater while spelling the word for it, she learned a dozen new words in only a few hours, and hundreds more in the months to come. Number 4. When Helen was only 11 years old, she was accused of plagiarism after the director of her school printed her story, which turned out to be just like one by another author. Number 5. For a couple of years, Helen attended one of the top prep schools in the country, called the Cambridge School for Young Ladies, where Annie had to sign all her lectures and many of her books. Number 6. Helen graduated from Radcliffe on June 28, 1904, making her the first deaf-blind person in the country to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree. 7. Once introduced to the world of politics, Helen became a member of the Socialist Party of America and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Number 8. When Helen was 36 years old, she fell in love for the first time with her secretary Peter Fagin, but her family didn't approve and ran him off. Number 9. Helen traveled all over the world to advocate for people with disabilities, raise money for the blind, and inspire everyone. 10. In 1964, a few years before Helen passed away, President Lyndon Johnson awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the country's highest civilian honor. 10 more things that are pretty cool to know. Number 1. Whenever Helen was photographed, Annie made sure that her picture was only taken from the right side because her left eye stuck out from her head and made her look blind. Number 2. Helen learned how to write with paper and pencil by using a ruler as a guide to keep her letters straight. It was such hard work. She often ended her letters by writing, "I am too tired to write more." 3. Helen could play chess. She had a special chessboard where the white pieces were a little bigger than the black ones, so she could tell them apart. 4. Although The Story of My Life wasn't a bestseller when it came out, it's a book that has withstood the test of time and culture. Over the last century, it's been translated into over 50 languages. 5. Helen had an operation to remove both her eyes and replace them with blue glass ones, because she and Annie didn't think she should appear in public with her protruding left eye. They kept her fake eyes a secret. 6. During her 1937 trip to Japan, Helen became the first woman allowed to touch the great Buddha of Kamakura, a huge statue of Buddha that weighs 93 tons. 3. While in South Africa, Helen received an honorary name from the Zulu tribe, Humvuselelo, which means, "You have aroused the consciousness of many." 8. Helen met with all the presidents of the United States from Grover Cleveland to Lyndon Johnson. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt once said, "Anything Helen Keller is for, I am for." 9. Between 1946 and 1957, Helen and Polly traveled to 5 continents and 35 countries, including a 40,000-mile tour of Asia. 10. Helen was the first woman ever to receive an honorary degree from Harvard, which she got when she was almost 75.